Hi, everyone. It is good to be with you for this July Sunday school. Sunday school. We're in this weird season where obviously we can't be together. 75 or 80 of us gathered in Parker Hall. That just wouldn't work. But we can find creative ways to study together this month as we would normally do. And so I'm excited to be with you in this way for the next 4 weeks. So here's how this is going to work, and then we'll dive into our first week's lesson. So every week prior to Sunday, we will send out a video, this video, which will include some kind of Bible reflection, some questions to think about, a story to study. And then along with the video, we will also include a short study guide. And that study guide will actually include three different things. I'm gonna share my screen with you so that you can kind of see where we're headed. But yeah, so each week you'll get a study guide that includes three things. Something to read. It will be most likely the story that or stories that we talk about in the video. You can read them for yourselves. I've also included some further readings, so if you want to read even beyond or add in a few similar readings, you can do that. The second step is reflect. Each week as I am with you via video, I will share with you some questions to reflect on, to talk about, to think about. So if you're doing this as an individual, then there are just questions for you to think about. If you're doing this with your family, with your spouse, with your partner, even with your kids, these are questions that you can reflect on together. And you could also do this as a Sunday school class or a small group. So if you gathered on Zoom, you would share the video with one another. And if you need some help with how to do that, give me a call and I can see if I can walk you through how to do that. But you can share the video and then reflect on these questions together as a group. So lots of options of how to go about studying together. The third part this year is respond. So each week, in addition to the study and the reflection, I'll give you one or two, maybe three different ways that you could actually respond actively to what you've read about and what you've reflected on for the week. So simple activities that you can do, again, as an individual or as a couple, or as a family, or as a small group. So just simple ideas. Some maybe might challenge your creative juices a little bit more than you're used to, but all of them are different ways that you can kind of actively respond to the stories that we are talking about together. So what stories are we going to do? What theme might we have? For the next 4 weeks, I'm going to share with you 4 weeks worth of Old Testament studies that maybe are a little bit odd and maybe don't necessarily go together. I think they do, at least in this season, and I'm going to try to kind of draw some connections between these 4 Old Testament stories. But they're ones that have kept kind of bubbling up for me during the season of kind of shelter in place, of pandemic and whatnot. I find all of these stories have given me something to think about in the season, and so I hope they give you something to think about as well. So let's dive into week 1. Let's talk about messy families. Right, so we have found ourselves in a really new season in regards to our life with our families, right? Many of you have either been stuck at home with your families for an extended period of time. Maybe you found yourself spending more time with your family than you are used to. For some of you, that might have been a good thing. For others of you, maybe that wasn't. Some of us have been kept apart from our families. We haven't been able to to be around our parents, our grandparents, as our children as much as we might be used to. So we've kind of had this different relationship, a different component to our relationships during the season. So what might be one thing that you have learned in this season about somebody in your family? Maybe you've learned something about your spouse or about your child or your parents or other family members that you didn't know until sometime after March, what was it, March 15th. So is there something that you've learned in this season? Maybe even something that you've learned about yourself and how you interact with your family. The book of Genesis is a book about families. Really, it's about one family in particular. We can break the book of Genesis up into three distinct parts. The first part is the creation story. It starts with God creating, in the beginning, and a few stories about Adam and Eve and those first humans. We move then into a time of restart. This is the story of Noah and his family and the flood. It's the story of the Tower of Babel and how people are scattered and languages are mixed up. So creation, and then really a second creation, a second go at it on God's part, because well, frankly, we didn't do a very good job from start one. Obviously, God's creation was perfect. We kind of jumped right into screwing it up. But by chapter 12 in Genesis, we move into a very distinct focus on one family, Abraham and Sarah's family. And of course, genealogy in the Bible being what it is, it kind of focuses on Abraham in particular. So by chapter 12, we get this sense of kind of genealogy and this kind of heading into, here's this, from Noah to Haran to Abraham. Now what's going to happen with this one family? And in chapter 12, we have God all of a sudden kind of focusing in on this one, on Abram and Sarai. And when we meet them, of course, they're old and they are childless. And yet God offers the world, really. God offers, God promises so many blessings on this family. All they're asked to do is to pack up everything and leave their country. God doesn't back down from amazing promises, but God also asks a lot in return of Abram and Sarah. Along the way, their names are changed by God, and it's funny, but we begin to kind of meet some very interesting characters along the road. So from chapter 12 in Genesis onward, we begin to meet and get to know the God who repeatedly introduces God's self as the God of your father Abraham, or the God of your father Isaac and his father Abraham. And so we see, again, God's kind of intentional focus on this one family. But none of the family stories that are told in Genesis are perfect stories by any imagination. Instead, the rest of the book of Genesis is filled with liars and tricksters and arrogant people who try to take kind of God's plan into their own hands. We see a lot of brokenness throughout the rest of this book. But we also see the ways in which God remains faithful to Abraham and to Sarah and to their families, and the way that God continues to work despite this family's brokenness, and indeed even because of this family's brokenness. So let's think about it. We think of Abram and Sarah, or Abraham and Sarah, as these great heroes of the faith. Indeed, when we see them again in the New Testament, particularly in the book of Hebrews, they are presented as great heroes of the faith. Their faith in God, their trust in God, and their willingness to go where God led them was amazing, and it was huge. And yet, multiple times throughout Abram and Sarah's story with God, Abraham passes Sarah off, or tries to pass Sarah off as his sister. Every time that happens, it's for Abraham to save his own skin. Sarah ends up in Pharaoh's harem, which is quite the threat to God's promise to bless Abraham and Sarah with a son with a whole host of children, as many as the stars in the sky. So Abraham doesn't, he seems to continually lose track of all that God has promised. Sarah's not really any better. Sarah at one point takes the matters into her own hands and tells her husband Abraham to lie with their slave woman Hagar. She conceives a son, Ishmael. And through the saga of Hagar and Ishmael and their relationship with Abraham and Sarah, we see how Sarah's desire to take matters into her own hands leads to a great deal of hurt and a great deal of brokenness. And we see the ways in which God redeems and continues to work in Hagar and Ishmael's life, despite Sarah's brokenness, despite the fact that this might not have been what was intended. God never abandons them, and God never strays from God's faithfulness. After Abraham and Sarah, we meet their son, Isaac, their long promised son, Isaac. We have this lovely story of love at first sight between Isaac and Rebekah, who becomes his wife. But that is immediately followed by the struggle of their sons, Jacob and Esau. We are presented with the story of these twins, Esau as a very crude and mannerless son, and Jacob as rather wily and a bit of a rascal. Jacob doesn't hesitate to trick his brother, nor does he hesitate to trick his father out of a great deal. And yet here's Jacob, through whom the blessing and the continued story of God and God's people kind of comes down through Jacob, despite the fact that he was such a trickster. We see Jacob and his love at first sight of Rachel, but also not just of Rachel, but of Rachel's flock of sheep. It's not just the woman that he loves, it's also her potential for bringing him wealth. We see the brokenness between Jacob and his brother, his twin Esau. We see the ways in which Jacob, who is the ultimate trickster, is also tricked by Laban as Jacob tries to finagle both Rachel's hand, but also her flocks. Ultimately, we meet Jacob, who's desiring to reunite with his brother, to be reconciled with his brother, and all of the struggle that goes along with that reconciliation. And we find Jacob wrestling on the side of the river Jabbok with a stranger. We, the reader, recognize the stranger as potentially a messenger from God, indeed God's self wrestling with Jacob. Jacob simply knows that he's wrestling with somebody unknown to him. Jacob is injured in this wrestling match. His hip is forever kind of messed up, and he will walk with a limp for the rest of his life. And it's at this point that Jacob receives a new name, Israel, this name from God. which means one who wrestles with God. And of course, we can, because we know where the story is leading, we can see how Jacob's wrestling with God indeed reflects the wrestling of God's people throughout, kind of even into today. So we see how the story kind of plays out. We walk alongside as Jacob meets his brother across what could potentially be a battlefield, but instead is a moment of great reconciliation between the two brothers who had been separated because of the lies and the tricks and the harm that had been done. Their stories move into the story of Jacob's sons, and we begin again a cycle of brothers tricking brother and lying to their father. Jacob, who had once lied so easily to his father Isaac, now becomes the one who is lied to, as 11 of his sons lie to him to say that his beloved son Joseph was dead, when in fact he was not. Those 11 sons have tricked their brother Joseph and sold him into slavery out of jealousy and out of spite. The rest of the book of Genesis is the story of Joseph and his how he hits rock bottom, but then also how he rises in power in Egypt, and how again a group of brothers are reconciled, and how again a father and son are reconciled, and the ways in which God is faithful throughout. So I invite you to spend some time this week looking through the book of Genesis, starting with chapter 12, maybe reading it again with fresh eyes to think about the ways that these families whom God has this incredible relationship with, how these families are not perfect, but indeed are incredibly messy and broken. So here are some questions maybe for us to think about together. Names matter. Names matter to the point that God goes around changing names. This doesn't just happen in the Old Testament, it happens again in the New Testament, from Jesus changing Peter's name to God changing Paul, Saul to Paul. But we see God change Abraham and Sarah's names. We see God change Jacob's name to Israel. So think about the names and what those names mean. But also think, where did your name come from? Who named you? Has your family ever had to or chosen to change their name in order to fit in? Maybe they were immigrants who adjusted their name so that they sounded less foreign. But yeah, where does your name come from? And what does it mean? Throughout Genesis, we see families experiencing great brokenness. Again, none of them are perfect. Now's a good time for us to reflect on our own families. Where have we seen brokenness in our families? Do we have stories of brothers who fell out over issues of inheritance? That seems to be a common story even today. The story that we read about Jacob and Esau, it very well could be similar to our stories or our family stories as well. Do we also have stories of reconciliation in our families, where sisters or brothers or children and parents have been reconciled? Maybe not easily, but then reconciliation is rarely easy because it does ask us to deal with the brokenness in a way that we have to put some things down in order to move forward together. So when we read the story of Jacob and Esau, or when we read the story of Joseph meeting his brothers in Egypt, when they are reconciled together, do we think about times in our families where something similar happened? We see Isaac and Ishmael, two brothers who, through no fault of their own, were born into a rather tricky situation because of Sarah and Abraham's lack of faith in God. But these two brothers meet together in order to bury their father, Abraham. Are there places where death has brought families together in a way that they weren't expected or weren't expecting? So where have we seen brokenness in our family, and where might we also see reconciliation? Genesis doesn't pull any punches. There's no way around it. Genesis tells the story of some pretty imperfect people. There's not, I don't think, a single character that we could say comes out just perfectly in any of these stories. They all have issues. None of them are perfect. They're not perfect in their faith. They're not perfect in their interactions with one another. And yet, when the book of Genesis is written, which, just as a point of kind of reference here, the book of Genesis itself is not written until generations later. There's not anybody kind of sitting down and taking down these stories while they're happening. No, this is a book that would have been written perhaps even as late as the exile, before someone actually sits down and starts writing down the stories of Abraham and Sarah, of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. And we can imagine that this makes sense, right? Because it's during the exile, when the people are scattered throughout the Assyrian, the Babylonian empires, that that the threat of losing the stories becomes very real. And so there begins to be a real sense of urgency about writing the stories down, about getting them together and kind of compiling them. But even as they are being compiled all of these generations later, the authors of Genesis, and there are multiple authors, that there are multiple writers and editors of Genesis and Exodus and the other books of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. No one pulls any punches. Nobody tries to whitewash or put any of these characters up on a pedestal. They tell both the good and the bad. So when we think about our family stories, do we only tell the good parts? Do we only tell the good parts? Or are we honest about both the good and the bad? Do we tell the story of struggle? Do we tell the stories of addiction, of brokenness? Do we tell our stories? Do we tell the messiness of our family stories? Are we honest about that? And I think that's really critical for us to begin to see both the good, but also the bad. Maybe one more question. Genesis might be about Abraham's family, but the book of Genesis is primarily about God. This is the story of God's relationship with one family in particular, and the way in which God worked through this family in order to bring about God's plan for all of creation. And so it's important for us as we read Genesis to look for the ways in which God is at work. Even through the long saga of Joseph's story, where God feels incredibly distant, both from Joseph himself, but also for us as readers, it's important for us to not lose sight of the ways in which God is at work in this family. The meeting between Abraham's servant and Rebecca, and the ways that that Isaac meets the love of his life, Rebecca. It's quick to just kind of pass over that as a story of how these two met and got together. But again, we should look for the ways in which God is at work in these stories. So when we tell our family stories, do we notice the ways, do we tell the ways that God has been faithfully working in us? Can we tell how God has been at work in our families throughout our history? And it's important for us to tell our stories, to tell our family stories. We don't often, like the Israelites in exile, we don't really realize until maybe it's too late how important it is for us to know our family story. But it's also important for us to be able to tell our family story with an eye to the ways in which God has been at work in us. So I hope that these questions are helpful for you. I know that they've certainly given me some things to think about over the last bit as I've been kind of preparing for this. And I will invite you to spend some time this week, maybe talking with family members. Try a FaceTime with your parents or your grandparents. Have your kids interview their grandparents and ask them stories about the good old days, or maybe the not so good old days. Look through pictures, organize pictures, but look through some old pictures and ask questions about who is in this picture and what were they doing and what do we know about them. And let's remember to tell both the good and the bad, to be honest about brokenness, to be honest about the mess that our families are, because indeed we all are, but also to look both in the past, the present, and also as we move on into the future for the ways in which God is faithfully working in us. Let's pray. Gracious God of our patriarchs and our matriarchs, God of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebecca, of these broken and yet beautiful people, these heroes of our faith. God, continue to work in our families the way that you worked in theirs. Show us opportunities for reconciliation where we need to be reconciled. Show us ways in which our own arrogance or disbelief have moved us off track. Continue to guide us so that we may tell our story to the generations to come as a mark of your faithfulness, as a reminder of the ways in which you love us and continue to work in us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Thank you guys for joining me for this video. And again, we will send this along with a study guide. It'll give you some reference for some of the stories that I've mentioned today, and also some more opportunities for reflection and for ways for you to respond. And then next week we will look at another Old Testament story that maybe is a little bit surprising, but a lot of fun for us to read. So thank you guys. Bye.